usual dialogue that you get in novels. It's all in his head.
That's very interesting because, and this is intended as a compliment to you, I didn't notice there was no dialogue in that first 100 pages.
Well, I'm not wrong. I hope you believe it now. I mean, that there's a little writing back and forth as he talks, as he communicates with
Yes.
people. He uses the computer somewhat later on, but he does that.
Yeah.
So he doesn't say anything for the first time. The reason I made him, it struck me in the beginning, he had to have a war wound. I wanted a wounded veteran, somebody as he began to take importance in the book. I thought he should be wounded, and the wound that I chose is because, as a person who can't hear, he was able to hear inner voices, and it prepared his way for actually the invasion of hallucinations into his mind, because he not only is deaf, but he has what they used to call shell shock. He is deeply psychologically traumatized, probably schizophrenic, and begins to hear voices almost immediately when he gets back. And those voices eventually come to dominate his inner life. And I knew if it was deaf, he could focus on those voices more clearly.
How interesting. So have you had the experience of talking to people who have read your novel and who are themselves either deaf or have PTSD, shell shock, whatever you wish to call it, or both, and some sense of, did you capture a world that they recognized, that they felt this was a world they knew?
Well, I don't always know if I talk to people what their background is, but I have, and so it's been read by some veterans, and it was read by a working soldier, just to make sure that what I thought put in there was accurate. And so I've had that, and they have said that it corresponds to their experience. People who have read it say it does correspond. I don't know how that happened, actually. My own military service was only 1 hour long. I was drafted. That's pretty short. Too much to really accumulate any knowledge of the military, but it was an hour.
1 hour.
Yeah, 1 hour. And I'll tell you how it happened very briefly, because it's not about me, the book. I was drafted in my draft board in Waterville, drafted me to the for service in the Vietnam War in 1965. And luckily, just the month before that, I had a baby. That is to say, my family had a baby and I had a son. So I packed my 1-month-old son over my shoulder. I walked down to the draft board, or into the draft board from the car, and I said, "Look at this." And they took my draft notice at that time and threw it in the wastebasket. So not only did my little son save my life, being just 1 month old, but also that was why I was able to have such a short military experience. And but I do also think I have a theory about literary characters and novel characters, and perhaps humans in general, that as we go through life, I do believe that we are unconsciously accumulating information about different professions and different people, almost collecting alternative lives unconsciously as we go through life. So when you need to have something like a soldier or a doctor or a mathematician, because I've just been reading Cormac McCarthy's The Passenger, if you need a mathematician or these characters, I mean, to some extent you can research them. To some extent you may draw your characters from people that you know. But in this case, the character came out of my own imagination. I didn't know anybody like this Nick. I had no experience really with veterans like this. I decided not to research it because I wanted to be in complete control of my character. And I didn't want to be dependent on any actual person. It wasn't a portrait. It wasn't a piece of journalism. He came out of my own unconscious mind, and I realized in writing him when I sat down. When I sat down to write him in my writing sessions every day, I had to be both deaf and shell-shocked, and I moved into that position and wrote from that. It just happened. I got used to it. I channeled him, I guess you would say. But it was to be out of my own self and into somebody else's mind, their innermost mind, was really a humbling and profound experience for me, just writing this. It was amazing.
Well, I found reading it very intense. I wonder, so a very important part of this was his relationship to the island. And I believe that you might be willing to read to us something about when he first goes out to the island. And I think that would be a wonderful way to slightly set the scene for both him and for the place in which the story takes place.
He rows to the island in a rowboat. It's about 2 miles off the shore. It's a 4-mile row because he goes diagonally out there, but and I don't know. I have a long passage where in which he leaves. He gets in trouble when he comes home, as you know. He comes home and tries to live a life of a veteran and tries to recover. But before long, he gets in trouble. A dog attacks him. A dog comes out and tries to bite him when he's riding his bike. And he comes down and he stabs the dog and he gets in huge trouble for animal cruelty. And he feels that he starts to feel that he better escape. He comes home to Maine to live in his little coastal town of Maine. He lives up in the room that he grew up in. But he realizes that he no longer is able to live in human civilization. So he looks out to sea and sees an island that he knows a little bit about. And he decides he reads Thoreau. He's an old teacher, comes to visit him and gives him a copy of Walden, and he reads it avidly because there's a lot in Walden about sound and not hearing and hearing inner things. So he decides that the best thing for him to do is to go to an uninhabited island where he can't bother anybody and he can't get in trouble and try to heal himself out there. So he gets an old rowboat and he rows out to the island. He's not completely unknown. This island has lain off the coast of his little coastal town all his life. Plus, his grandfather worked there as they had a stone quarry on the island. So his grandfather, who immigrated from Italy, was out there as a young man living on this island. The quarry is now defunct, but nevertheless, he feels very close to it because his grandfather was a laboring man out on this island. A second relation he has to this island is that just before he went into the service, just before he went overseas, he and his girlfriend went and camped out for a week on the island. And so he has some memories, even though she has dumped him in the interim, and he's pretty sad about her. He does have some deep and abiding erotic memories of camping with his girlfriend for a week on the island. And he somehow goes, to some extent, he's going out to visit that. So he's visiting his grandfather, he's visiting his old girlfriend, but mostly he's going to a place where he thinks he will be all by himself. He's going to an uninhabited island. Later, it turns out that it's not so uninhabited, but that's what, and he goes out to try to heal himself in silence and peace in the island. But as it turns out in the book, he finds another mission out on the island because it's not as peaceful as it looked. Nothing is peaceful. A soldier who comes home from combat, who brings the war home with him. And the war is in himself. And so when he goes out there, and there's also, on this island, there's also a war on the island. The siblings that have inherited the island don't have completely different views of how it should develop. One of the daughters wants to develop an eco-tourist resort on the island, and the other daughter wants to have it completely pristine and never touch it. And so he comes to an island which already has a civil war brewing in it, and goes from there. But that's, so anyway, so he wrote, you asked if I would read a little bit of this. Sure. I'll read a paragraph where he just leaves, where he takes off. I mean, he's actually pretty scared. He takes off in the middle of the night. He sneaks out of his parents' house. He thinks the cops are after him. So he sneaks out in the night. He jumps, he's bought a dory, he had an old dory. He jumps in a dory and he rows, hoping, and he rows. And even as he rows away from the shore, and think of Rockland, you know, where with a big ferry terminal there, as he rows away from the shore out to the island, he sees the strobe lights of a police car coming up, and he realizes that they may be after him. So he rolls like hell. He realizes that there's a fog bank off the coast, and if he can get out into the fog, he figures he won't see the cops anymore and they can't get him. I'll read a little bit of this. If his folks find his empty bed, they'll call the cops, and the blue strobes will start flashing on the waterfront. Beyond the breakwater lighthouse, there is a wall of white fog, and if he can make it that far, he won't be seen. He's trying to row away from civilization. And he lays the duffel, and this is the stuff that he brought with him. He lays the duffel gently on the dory's stern seat, undoes the lines holding it to the float, and pushes off into the growing light. No time to lose. His own weight in front balances his gear, and the freshly painted gray oars slide easily forward along the floorboard. He hammers the pins in place with the butt of his K-bar knife, centers the oars on their leather collars, leans forward and submerges their blades in water that's black as night and brimming with phosphorescence like the Milky Way. With the first stroke, his course alters from random drift to purposeful escape. His eyes face the waking shoreline as his back strains forward into the unknown. Soon as he rounds the breakwater, he gets out his dad's compass and sets the course needle to northeast diagonally across the ship channel toward an invisible island on the other side. Muscles kick in that had been sleeping all their lives, and his hands are already chafing from the unsanded grips. Back on the waterfront, the cops, lights flashing, have pulled to the terminal and departed, maybe looking for a fugitive from his own existence, maybe for someone else. Okay, that's one paragraph where he takes off. And in it, and if you think we have time, it might be nice to look at the cover at this point. You think so? I can't hear you.
I can do
Are
that.
you mute?
My
Okay.
apologies, I was muted. Yes, I
Okay.
was about to suggest that this was the perfect time to show people the cover, because you're talking about him rowing and the cover responds to that. Jane, can you share your screen so everyone can see the cover?
Oh, thank you. That's really great. Yeah, well, you know, it's funny, after this book had been out since last year, and I know I liked the cover when it came, but just recently I was looking at the cover and seeing how much is said about the book in that cover. We know, first of all, he's rowing, and we could tell this is, he's going from one place to the other. He's going from the mainland where he can hardly exist to an island where he hopes he can have a new life. He is exactly reflected in the still surface. And that the whole idea all through the book is that he is a dual person. He has a life, but he also has an unconscious life that goes along with him. Mirror images are really important in the book, and they become most important in the book's climax. And so here he is rowing that this, to me, this is a perfect person of this. This is his existence in life, and that's his inner existence mirrored in the water. Not only that, but the old boat that he's rowing reminds him of the boat that his grandfather rowed, because when his grandfather came in from the stone quarry into town to court his wife, he rowed in an old boat like this, and he rowed back and forth between the island as a stone worker. He rowed back and forth between the island and the mainland to see his young bride to be. So we got this, we got the old dory, we've got this. Also, the interesting thing about this is, look, he's facing backwards. He's facing his past. He has no idea of what's in the future. But the thing I mostly liked and was so thrilled when I saw the cover produced by Islandport Press was the background, which to me is not only camouflage in color, the color of uniforms in the service, but also is an explosion. And to me, it reflects the explosion that he is rolling away from that took his two best friends when his vehicle was hit by an IED. It took his two best friends and it also deafened him and caused the trauma that he's living with. So he's moving away from this explosion. And at the same time, he can only look backwards. He can't, the future is completely unknown to him and he's moving toward it. And the explosion also reflects the chaotic future of what this novel is going to be. He thinks he's going to a peaceful island and what he's going to is another theater of war. So yes, I mean, I guess I've said that about but that all of that is said to me in the cover.
Well, I think it's a beautiful cover, so I'm glad you thought of showing it to everybody. I think, Jen, maybe we can see William big and large again. There we go. Lovely.
That's fine. Thank you for indulging me with that. But
no, it was good. It's a very good cover. So one of the other things in this that you haven't mentioned yet, and I think it would be nice to talk about a little bit, is that when he's on the island, he also discovers something else quite extraordinary that becomes very, very important to him. And I think, could you tell people a little bit about that, unless you think it's giving too much away? But
no, I think it's wonderful. That's to me what really, and I have to say, I have to speak of it in terms of a writer writing it, because this is another place where the story overpowered the writer. I thought that he was just going to go out there and take over the abandoned cabin, but when he got there and rode and pulled up his dory on the shore and moved and went into the abandoned cabin, he began to explore around the island. And one of the first things that he saw, amazingly, was a great tree that had been uprooted from the soil. And you know, anybody who lives in Maine knows what these trees look like. You see a windblown tree, the roots suddenly stick up 20 feet up in the air, the root system, and they've got this great circular root system. Can't hear you.
It again, really, I should know better by now. I'm going to interrupt you for a moment for a reason.
Of course.
I had bookmarked, when I was reading this, a passage that's exactly at this moment in the book. And one of the things I loved in your book was the nature writing and the sense of place. If I may, could I read everybody this paragraph?
Absolutely.
And it's not going to give away exactly what he finds. I'm going to leave that for you to do, but I want your description of the place. So it's brief. The stream stops and it runs underground at a huge blowdown spruce whose upright and tangled root system was ripped out of the gravel bank like an impacted tooth. The roots reach 3 or 4 meters into the air, grasping at earth and stones as if alive. Its fall tore out a raw crater in the stream bank, streaked with a dense rust color from the ferric soil. It's still moist from the big rain, which must have eroded the topsoil, so the exposed gravel bank bleeds out like a bayonet wound. It's veined with packed, broken mussel and whelk shells, as if it had been a clam flat in another time. The sea level rose over this whole coast in the past, and they say it will come again by our own hand. And when he pulls one of these shell layers, it flakes off and it slides down the embankment like the remains of a clamp bake or the dumpster behind an oyster bar. Okay, so I just thought this would give a flavor of how you write about the place. And in it, you also have these allusions to his back to what he's just lived through, the bayonet wound, for example, and at intervals, you do this and you use words about the earth bleeding and things. But anyway, he finds this ripped out tree in this bank of earth. And then over to you, Bill.
Okay, well, I'll read the next paragraph on page 66, right? That okay? The cool, moist, russet-tinted earth soothes his raw palms as he cups and wedges his fingers into the gravel bluff. Then they strike something hard and can't go further, probably a stone. He unstraps his knife. He's always carrying this big military knife. He unstraps his knife to clear away the clamshells and dig it out, then gets his fingers around it and gently pulls. An elongated shape comes out the size and shape of a large razor clam and coated with packed earth. He dampens one of his bandages in the groundwater at its feet and rubs the soil off. It's not red granite, but a local green chlorite slate he recognizes because at Davis Stonecraft, they slice and polish it for countertops. At any rate, he comes to a place, and what is uprooted by that tree, what is exposed, is that is a burial site, what turns out to be a burial site for a prehistoric culture of the maritime archaic people. Recent storm, these people have been buried for 6,000 years, this civilization. And just because the windstorm took out this great tree, it exposed, the action of the tree getting ripped out exposed this bank, which is filled with actually, and what he pulls out of there, the first thing he pulls out is a knife, a slate knife that has been buried in there for 6,000 years. And eventually he finds quite a few artifacts of that kind. A swordfish, because the culture that he found was a sword fishing culture. They went out in boats into the Gulf of Maine and they caught swordfish in dugout canoes on the high sea, and they brought it back and ate them. And so this culture, he happens to just run into it. This is amazing. And it says, I'm going to read the last few sentences of that chapter that you were reading. Nobody seems to live here on Amber Island. No human presence or habitation. Just the rotting tent platforms, the abandoned shack. He may be the first to have reached this spot since it was unearthed by the wind and rain. He came here driven by lost instinct and coincidence of time, but also a sense of intention, as if he had been walking or rowing toward it all his life. What did Henry say? And he means Henry Thoreau. Speech is for the convenience of the hard of hearing. Maybe it's the privilege of silence to witness that the unspoken and unheard. So he thinks it's because he has been stricken deaf that he was privileged to come to a culture, to come and find these things. And I have to say, personally, it's interesting. When I was, and this happened as I was writing his story. He just went there by himself. He pushed through the bushes. He followed some old sheep tracks on the island. He came to this route as if he were directed to it. And somebody early on reading the book said, isn't it too much of a coincidence that he gets there at this island and finds this archaeological treasure that no one has ever seen? And so I had one of my readers was skeptical about it, but I kept it because I think there's there's a tiny bit of the supernatural in this, that he comes there and he finds this. And yet I wanted to place him, because he was hurt and because he was deaf, I wanted to place him in a special condition and almost put him give him a sense of destiny. Because this happened, because he was silenced, he was privileged to find this. And it sounds preposterous to find such a thing, but once when I was sailing and rowed up and anchored my boat and rowed up on the shore to explore it a bit, I looked at a bank that was storm eroded. This is on MDI, a bank that was storm eroded. I looked again, and coming out of that bank were pieces of ancient pottery.
Oh, really?
Astonishing. Yes, absolutely. And I looked and I dug a little bit, just as he does. I went in and there was another and another. I couldn't believe it.
So it's autobiographical.
I guess the thing that he found and came up with was actually in my own memory too, as something I had done. And my sister also had worked at the Turner Farm site on North Haven, where they found the culture of the maritime archaic people, the red paint people, what used to be called. And so I had the privilege there of going out to visit her at her site at the archaeological site where she was. And I saw what they were digging up. I saw what they dug up in the Turner farm site. And I realized that they were also finding, even though they couldn't speak of it, I kind of knew that they were finding human remains.
Oh, ah,
And so does he.
yeah.
So does he. And he, but just to go on, one more sentence of this. He identifies with this culture. He finds he has come home. And when he gets a job as a caretaker on the island, he vows silently, he takes the job, even though he hates the idea that the island's being developed. He takes the job because he knows if he's on the island, he can protect this from ever being, he can cover it up again, he can replant it, he can protect these artifacts, and he can protect these buried people from any violation that would come in the development of the island. And so he actually considers himself, when he gets to the island, to have a new mission. A new mission is to protect these long people, these people who have been for 6,000 years buried here, to protect them from invasion. When he was in Iraq, he witnessed looting of the museums of Iraq, and he doesn't want this to happen here. So he sets himself up as a guard of a museum culture that's preserved under the earth. That may be more than I need to say, but to me, that's very important.
No, I like that thread in the book very much. Bill, I'm going to use my power as the sort of host to move the conversation sideways. People will have a chance to ask questions, but before that, I wanted to move away from the book itself and ask you a little bit about things that I know from the past always interest people. So your sort of process of writing, so how you became a writer, why you write, how you fit it into the rest of your life, because you have a busy teaching life. You're not a full-time writer, you do other things with your time. So could you talk a little bit about that? And then I'll tell you the other question I'd also like to fit in is the relationship between your own writing and your teaching of writing.
Well, I owe it to Maine, I have to say. When my first job was at the University of Chicago, and I was destined, I think, to be a scholar among that great university faculty, and that I didn't have any interest or occasion or ability or calling or vocation to do any writing of my own. I was a Yeats scholar. I love modern poetry. That was my specialty. Virginia Woolf was a keen interest for me, and she's a little bit in back of this particular book. So I was a scholar, and then I was involved in a massive shutdown in 1970 at the University of Chicago. There was a great strike, and the students took over the building. It was typical of that university of that. But I thought, we can do better than this. This isn't what education should look like. And so I luckily went home to Maine, where I was from, and looked at the Maine Times, which was published at that time, and saw an advertisement that a new college was going to be starting up in Bar Harbor, Maine. And I said, okay, I'm out of here. I'll write them a letter and see if they're interested. And so I wrote a letter and got actually the job, which was the first faculty job at the College of the Atlantic. And I went there, and over the first couple of years, I kind of forgot my scholarly destiny. And I was just moved by the Maine coast. I had a sailboat. I immersed myself, in nature the way you can here. And it clearly appeared to me that it was better for me to be writing poetry than writing about it. And I had a student in that first year, and he was really, he was a transfer from Bennington, and he's a good poet himself. And he said, that was a great course. He said to me, that was a great course, but I wish we had a real writer teaching it. And so I said, okay. If I'm going to teach here, I'm the only English teacher. I better start writing. So I learned how to teach writing. So it was half, so I started writing poetry. And the minute I started up with that, living in Maine and live under those circumstances, close to nature, that's what came out. So I wrote a lot of poetry then, and wrote until my poems got bigger and bigger and bigger. And they outgrew any kind of decent regulatory length for poems. And so I started to write, and I wrote a novel. It just carried over into writing my first novel back in the 80s during the AIDS crisis. And that I wrote in the first person guise of a female. Once again, I didn't want to write autobiography. I had to write something very different for me. I'm not a soldier or a woman or a lobster person, a lobster fisherman, but I like these opposite personalities that I know are inside me, and I can dig them up. My inner lobster man, my inner woman, and my inner soldier, and find them and write about them. So I made that transition, and now I've been thinking I could never go back to writing about stuff, though I deeply value the work of literary critics. Once you have tasted blood of actual writing, it's hard to go back to the other liquids.
That is just a really wonderful idea to end this part of our talk on, and see if the other people in the group have questions they'd like to ask you. So why don't, if anyone else has questions for Bill, you unmute yourself, wave your hand, or just start talking.
There is one
because-
in the chat from Joe. I know she's.
Yeah,
had
so
to
Joe,
log off the
so
call.
there is indeed, thank you. Well, first of all, there's a comment in the chat from Joe, because she was really sorry to leave. She said, "What marvelous writing. I look forward to reading his book." So I thought you'd like me to pass that on to you, Bill.
That's great. Thank you very much. That's wonderful.
But her question says, "I'm wondering how you gained the knowledge of the character's military experience."
Oh, well, by the time I wrote it, there were a lot of oral history books out from returning veterans. So I had plenty of source in that sense. But I was speaking before, and I really meant it, that I do believe unconsciously over our whole lives, we pick up stuff, stuff about soldiers. That's why novelists can write about surgeons. Novelists who had never even handled a jackknife can write about being a brain surgeon, because you can.
Well, yes.
Ian
McEwan in particular.
I'm exactly thinking of Ian McEwan. Exactly, that's what I was thinking of. And I'm also thinking of the mathematician. I'm also thinking of Cormac McCarthy's book, The Passenger, the recent book, in which his main character is a professional mathematician, a mathematical genius. Well, Cormac McCarthy's not a mathematical genius, and so how can you do it? Well, I think it's fun. I have to be mysterious in the answer. I think it's a mystery, but I think it is true that people have alternative selves. And for example, I think probably everybody who writes could make a doctor, because you've had enough doctors and you've been to enough doctors, and you may not have paid attention to them, but your unconscious mind was picking up these doctors and after a while, I think for a novelist, after a while, experience with a profession like that experience, and I mean war books, war movies. A close relative of mine happens to be in the U.S. Special Forces, and so that really and other, I've had many veterans who have been students, and so all of those things have the power of accruing to a single personality in the unconscious. For me, this was, and so when it was time for it, that soldier just came out. And it's funny, because I believe that there's stuff that I wrote that I didn't know consciously that I hadn't acquired. But then you see a lot of war movies all your life. I was a war baby. I was brought up with the first thing I made in my shop course in the 7th grade was a machine gun. We use it to kill. After school, we just mow down the communists during the Korean War. A lot of soldier. And so when it's time to make a soldier, I was able to do that. I checked it through with people who had been in the service, and they all said it was okay. This is my things were right. And there was a certain amount of research that involved it. But that person, Nick Colonna, was inside, manufactured internally by unconscious processes. I never, and there he was. Is that too much of a mystery?
No, I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions for Bill? I'm looking at the chat in case anyone types one in.
Okay, well,
Not at the moment.
if you have any more questions, if you don't, I could
No.
read something.
No, I
Let's go.
well, what was the next thing? I did have a couple of other things. Hold on a moment. Oh yes, well, a sort of an observation, which maybe I could just bolster with reading one other short passage I was very struck by. It had to do again with the experience of being deaf. So you say at one point, he's on the island and he's going through his duffel, which his mother has filled with stuff and sent out to the island. And
Yes, right.
And he says, he picks up some old shorts and a Radiohead t-shirt, carrying all the scents of the laundry room at home, even the lotion that his mum uses on her hands. And then you say, his sense of smell was grown as keen as a bomb dog. His nose had blistered and grown numb in the sandbox from the diesel and the sewage stench and ammunition and blown out oil wells and rancid street food and the odor of ever-present death. Now he can see with his nostrils like an animal. He can tell which side of the island he's on and where the wind is and if the sheep have been around the cabin or a distant tanker has navigated up the bay. At one point, he pulled his watch cap down over his eyes and smelled his way from the cabin to the South Cove Pier, knowing where he was at every turn by scent, the path with its balsam and hint of wild garlic on the right and decaying beech leaves on the left, the stereophonic balance of salt sea and balsamic fir. Anyway, it's a longish passage. I'll pause there. But I was fascinated by this idea that when you lose one sense, in his case, hearing, other senses get heightened. And I thought this passage was terrific and really brought that back.
Well, I have no experience. I've not lost a sense to the point that I've ever developed any sixth sense, but I've heard that happens, and so I thought, well, that's what I would write out. That was just a rumor that other senses come in when you lose one sense. I don't know if that's really true from personal experience, but I tried it out in there, and it turned out that he was able to smell. And I think he's getting like an animal. He had all these sheep that he was taking care of. He was living somewhat an animal-like existence in that. When he came to that cabin that he took over, it had been lived in by animals beforehand. Okay, so we have a few minutes if you would like me to read a passage.
I think that would be great. And just one last quick chance in case anyone has questions for you, but otherwise, yes, another passage would be great.
I can also be totally interrupted. I'll tell you the passage.
Go for it, Bill. Read us something.
I'll tell you the passage I'd like to read. The one I had most fun writing was the following. And it is, he's in his cabin. He's been out clearing the woods. He has, with his chainsaw, it has started to rain. He's gone back to his cabin. And this is an interesting thing to me that happened also. He didn't care anything about food, but on the island, he became a locavore gourmet. He started to not only catch fish and meat and rabbits and stuff, but also to pick beach peas and to gather certain grasses and to gather seaweed and everything, and to really become a cook living off the land. And mussels and seafood is what he ate. And so I'm just saying, okay, so when it's pouring rain, he's gone back to his cabin. He's going to have a good meal. He lights up the stove. He cooks his food. The windows all gloss over with condensation, the windows of his cabin. And he's about to have a good meal. But then he looks out the window again and he sees something outside. And he lives all alone and he sees something. And I'll read this. With his dish towel, he clears steam from the window like a memory outside. The hail's smaller now, pea-sized, but still peppering the overturned dory like a firing squad. Then he clears the pane and looks again. through the slant hail and wet sweeping fog, an upright shape. An upright shape walks toward him entirely concealed in a sky blue burqa, with only the eyes showing and a humped back like a deformed freak out of a dream. Okay, this is coming. This is a huge storm outside, and coming toward him is this figure that scares him to death. It's wearing a burqa, that is to say, one of garment very familiar to him from Iraq, one of the full-length coverage that Muslim women often wear when they're out in the street. Okay, so it's in a burqa, and it seems like a freakish shape. What could it be? His first thought is, they've fucking come for him. Either Dupuy or Ramos, these are his dead friends, either Dupuy or Ramos or some Baathist zombie has crossed from the other side. From the brace of guns against the back wall, he instantly picks his shotgun, which will spray lead even if his aim is bad. He'll stand his ground at the threshold, but he won't go out there. He prays with tight, silent lips that the apparition will walk on past and disappear into the hail and mist and beyond recollection when the weather clears. But the burqa keeps coming along the footpath through the downpour, and he knows in 5 seconds it's going to be either them or him. Okay, a monstrous vision is coming through. There's nothing but a cracked wooden turn latch to keep the door closed, which will explode open in an instant. And he wishes that he'd done more about security. 3 miles of deep water channel is not an obstacle if the time has come. He stands before his door with the gun pointed at chest height, waiting for the breakthrough, but it doesn't happen. See, he's deaf and he can't hear the knocking on the door. He circles to look out the window toward the front door, but the hail's even worse, and the panes are thick with condensation, so he can't see. The steam from the mussel pot is turning black as the last drops of seawater must be drying up. Keeping the .410 shotgun trained on the door planks, he edges to clear a window pane with his palm and jumps back when he sees a human hand against the same glass, trying to wipe it from the outside. Why aren't they entering? Why aren't they forcing their way through? Finally, he feels the door and it pulses like something's striking the other side. He turns the latch and swings it open the way they were trained, pushes the shotgun barrel right up against the burqa, with the rainwater sluicing down off the roof over its hood. One hand goes up and the other pulls the head cover off, and it's not a black ghost or Arab, but a pale, wet human female with gold earrings and her mouth open, trying to speak through a deluge of hail and rain. He's seen that face before, over and over. She has been sent every night to kill him in his dreams.
That's wonderful. And also it's a lovely passage because it's a slight cliffhanger. There's a whole a chunk of the book that we haven't mentioned sort of semi-deliberately, because I feel that that for readers to come to this book without knowing that is what's going to happen next is good. So we're going to keep that secret. You have to read this book. It just blew me away. I think it's a wonderful book, Bill. I really, really remarkable book.
Well, that was fun. Yeah.
Thank you. And my job is to sort of wrap this up. So for those of you on the call, I just want to thank Bill, obviously, terrific, but also to tell you what's coming up next. So it's Christmas, so we're taking time off. But on the 26th of January, we have Roseanne Montilla, who's going to speak about her book, Deliberate Cruelty, Truman Capote, The Millionaire's Wife, and the Murder of the Century. So that's a pretty good collection of things. And in February, we have Sarah Perry talking about her book, After the Eclipse. And going ahead to March, we have Tom Urquhart, Up for Grabs, Timber Pirates, Lumber Barons, and the Battles over Maine's Public Lands.
Wow.
So we've got a great winter program. Jen, thank you so much for running everything so well. Thank you for coming, those of you who are in the call. And Bill, thank you again. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. That's wonderful. I appreciate this. And this is great.
Clapping hands there.
Great questions. Yeah, great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank
Okay,
you.
goodbye, everybody.
Yeah,
Goodbye.
bye, Bill. Many, many thanks. And we'll get the video to you. And if we don't, if
very
you
good.
don't
Okay,
get it, then send us an email and we'll make sure you get it.
Very
Okay.
good. Okay.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.